Now, we're not officially in a series, but we are unofficially in a series. If we were to call what we're doing right now a series, we'd probably call it God in His Own Words, but we're not doing that. Anyway, this week I'm teaching a message really asking a pretty big question. Is God angry with you? So tune in and let's find out. Well, hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today. Now, I'm going to start with a question that's kind of a riff on a question we asked last week. The question is simply this: what is God like? And I want you to think about that, like what your answer would be, not in a lengthy, paragraphs, pages, books, just in a few words. What words would you choose, would you use to describe what God is like? Maybe best case scenario, you'd use the classic love. God is love. God is just. Okay, sure. And, there's a longer list of good things. Maybe worst case scenario, you might think, well, God's indifferent. God's disappointed in me. And the reality is, a lot of people actually have a clear picture of God in their minds, but not necessarily an accurate picture. And it's not enough to have a clear picture, particularly if and when that picture isn't accurate. Now, there's a famous Bible college professor in Illinois named Scot McKnight, and Scot McKnight, he teaches every semester a course on Jesus. One of the things that he does every semester is he issues 2 surveys. Early on in the semester, he issues his students a survey to describe themselves, questions about what they like, what they don't like, and just trying to paint a picture from them of how they would describe themselves. And then later in the semester, Scott would give them a second survey to describe what Jesus is like, what Jesus likes, what Jesus doesn't like. And then he would take each individual student's survey responses for themselves, what they are like, and then he would compare them to their response of what they think Jesus is like. And he astonishingly would find that approximately 90% overlap in the responses, that students who describe themselves in a particular way in the first survey, in 90% of the cases, would describe Jesus in the very same way. And to me, that speaks of the mistake, the temptation to, rather than consider ourselves as being made in God's image, that we mistakenly can too often try to or settle for making God in our image, sort of limited by our own experiences, filtered through our own lenses and personalities and frame of reference, and very much limited by our own capacity. The problem is that when we start to make God in our image, we only experience God to the level of our own experience and our own capacity. And God wants so much more for us. So I want to put it to you, and many big brain Bible scholars over the years have made this exact same claim, that this question, what is God like, is one of the most important, if not the most important questions any of us can ever answer. So, in the words of the modern day prophet Joe Jonas, who recently was embroiled in the media with some controversy that was kind of being pointed at him, he simply said to them, If it doesn't come out of my lips, don't believe it. So we haven't given this series a title, but if we were to give it a title, we'd probably call it God in His Own Words. So, you've got your smartphone camera. How about you scan this flow code? And it's going to take you to Exodus chapter 34, right back in the beginning of the Bible. Exodus chapter 34. Now, here's the context of what I'm about to drop us into. Moses, he'd been appointed by God to lead the people of Israel. There was over 1 million of them. So needless to say, it was a tough gig. And whilst Moses wanted to do it well, he felt inadequate and he was finding himself getting frustrated. So he kind of screamed out to God, how am I supposed to know what you want me to do if I don't know accurately what you're like? And interestingly, God answered his request to put into words and describe to Moses, and in turn to us today, using 5 words / small expressions to describe what he's like, God in his own words. And in fact, this, where I'm going to drop us into, this same description is referenced more than any other verse on repeat in the entire Bible. Over 20 times, God has used other authors to come back to and reference God's own description of himself. And this is how God described himself to Moses and ultimately to us. He's saying, I am the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. I'm slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. Now, last week we teed off with the very thing that God teed off with, this idea of compassion, and we asked the question, does God have compassion for you? So, if you missed that, I'd encourage you to go back on this channel and watch it, or go to your favorite podcast app, search for Elevate Church Perth, and listen to that and catch up. Today, I want to move on to this idea and ask the question, is God angry with you? Now, this idea of anger, it's been a central theme in my life for multiple decades. Growing up, my father, who himself had had a very, very rough upbringing, he would often default to anger as his weapon of choice. Eventually, he grew beyond that, to his credit. But he was quick to anger when I was growing up. And I can't blame him for my own actions, but I'm sure some of that carried over to my life. In my 20s and my early 30s, I was quick to anger. And I know in my own experience, being quick to anger, it eroded trust. It destroyed relationships. In fact, it almost destroyed my marriage in the first 5 years. So it's vital that we take our cue from God and that we learn to be slow to anger. And some of you get this. You're like, man, I just about lose my salvation when someone cuts me off in traffic. Yeah, that's because you're quick to anger. You're easily triggered. Now, I've taught a lot about this before, and I'm going to teach about it again. It's not the focus of what I want to teach today, but I did want to just frame this. And I want to say this to you. If you are someone who right now in your life, you're in the habit of being quick to anger, and it's causing erosion of trust in the people around you, it's causing relationships to be destroyed, can I just tell you this? Please do not leave that unattended. See, my father could have left it unattended and given all the excuses in the world. Well, I grew up without a father. I didn't even meet my father. I could have said, well, you know, my father, it's just a Pomeroy thing. It's always going to be this way. Well, my dad didn't settle for that. And I'm just telling you I'm also proof positive that you can grow beyond being quick to anger. But today I want to focus on God's description of Him being slow to anger. And for some of you, this might be breaking news, because for some of you, you might have the idea that God's like the Incredible Hulk. You know, don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Some of you have got people in your sphere who think God's angry. You know, you might have invited them along to church at some point in time, and they've said something to the effect of, "Oh, no, I could never get in. I could never step foot into a church. God would strike me down with lightning." Well, is that true? Well, for the record, God doesn't say He never gets angry. He simply declares that He's slow to anger. Which, by the way, that phrase in the original Hebrew and in the cultural context, literally translated as long of nostrils. That God said to Moses, "I am long of nostrils. I have a long nose." And if you were reading that in the original language, you'd be thinking like, wait, what? What's the length of God's nose and nostrils got anything to do with who He is? Well, hold that thought. Now, today there is a universal, well, what some of us describe as the universal sign of displeasure. Now, I'm not going to give it to you because someone might screenshot that and then I'm going to end up on some social media channel somewhere. But it's called flipping the bird. It's not as universal as you might think. I didn't have time to go into that. But there is one scientifically proven universal sign of displeasure. And it's the reality that when we get angry, our face actually heats up and our nostrils flare. In fact, the Hebrew culture actually had kind of two contrasting phrases to describe people who were either quick to anger or slow to anger. People who are quick to anger, they called them hot nose. And people who were slow to anger, they called them long nose. So there's that. But the important thing is that God wants us to know He's in the second group. Long nose. Slow to anger. He's patient. He gives us lots of time and lots of opportunities to change. He gives us second chances, third chances, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, sometimes even more chances. That's because He wants us to come to our senses, because ultimately His mission is to rescue us and restore us. So His default isn't anger. He's not using anger as His weapon of choice. He's using love and compassion. But again, He doesn't say He doesn't get angry. He just says He's slow to anger. Again, hold that thought. Because buried in here is another seeming contradiction. God says, I'm slow to anger and filled with unfailing love. Anger, love. God's saying He's both. Well, that might be a little bit puzzling to you if you grew up being taught that love and anger or love and hate are like diametrically opposed, mutually exclusive opposites, if you like. But actually, I want to put it to you that the opposite of the opposite of love isn't anger. The opposite of love is indifference. Let me share this story. So when I was in elementary school, I was probably like 6, 7 years old. My parents would allow us on our birthdays, my brother and I, to choose where we would like to go to celebrate. Now, there weren't many options back then. That's like 1,000 years ago. And secondly, my parents weren't people of great means, so we only had a few less expensive places. But nevertheless, it was the only time in the year that we went to those less expensive restaurants. And it was our birthday, and I was excited. This was my birthday. I chose the place, and we were going there, and it involved parking on one side of a reasonably busy highway and at the traffic lights, crossing the pedestrian crossing. Well, I kind of got near the pedestrian crossing, and being 6 or 7 and very impulsive, I just started to run or attempt to run across the street, and my mother somehow had the reflexes of a cat and grabbed me and pulled me back. She wasn't angry. She didn't hate me. She loved me. And in fact, I'm going to state the obvious here. If she hadn't done that, you would accuse her of being indifferent to my safety, my welfare. And that's very much how it is with God. It's indifference, not anger, is the opposite of love. God is not indifferent, sitting on the sidelines just watching us run into oncoming traffic. No. He also gives us some kind of real-world opportunities to play our part in this. That there's actually a place for anger, and that place for anger, when it's motivated by love and compassion, is very, very appropriate and very much acting in the image and likeness of God. When you see a kid getting bullied in the playground, hopefully your response is to get angry about that. When you hear stories of sex trafficking and slavery, which, by the way, there are more slaves on the planet today than ever in human history, motivated by love, the right response is anger, not indifference. When we hear people using racist words or demonstrating racist actions, don't be indifferent. That ought to raise up the level of anger in us. When we hear about loan sharks in developing countries loaning money to people to start a small business, but charging them fees that family could never actually repay, and then forcing them to have to make some very dire choices, I hope that makes us angry. When we hear about vulnerable people getting scammed, sometimes elderly people being scammed out of their life savings, I hope that makes us angry. And I could keep adding to this list. See, it's indifference, not anger, that's the opposite of love. In fact, God, when he gets angry, he didn't say he won't get angry. He does say he's slow to anger. But when he gets angry, it's motivated by love and compassion. He doesn't want us running headlong into oncoming traffic. And then I'll just share, I think, a final sticking point, at least for today, of why some people kind of get a little bit confused. A distorted view of God being angry. And it's this idea that, for many people, God's like thunderbolt and lightning, very, very frightening. But Jesus, on the other hand, I've seen the pictures. Jesus, he's sweet. He cuddles little lambs. He could never be angry with me. And that completely overlooks the fact that Jesus got angry on multiple occasions. And I'll just give you one example. So, on a particular day, as Jesus would regularly do, he went to the temple. Went to the temple to meet with God like Jewish people did and do. In the courtyard of the temple, Jesus got angry. Now, here's the deal. When you went to the temple, you would typically bring an offering Or it could be a sacrifice, which was also a form of an offering. And the offering could be money, or it could be like some form of animal, if you're particularly in the agricultural sphere, and that's how you earn your money, in the form of livestock. And so people would come to the temple and they would give into the temple treasury money, or they would offer up animals as a sacrifice. But people that couldn't either, like didn't have any money, they were given the option, didn't have any money or didn't have access to an animal, they were given the option of purchasing an animal, a pigeon, something like that. There was people set up like a marketplace, like come to my booth and you can buy a pigeon. But here's the thing, if you don't have any money, you can't afford to buy a pigeon. And what that would mean for the people who found themselves in this position, no money, and didn't have or couldn't afford to buy an animal to sacrifice, they weren't actually allowed in the temple. They weren't actually allowed, they were prohibited from meeting with God. There was this two-tiered system in play. And Jesus went absolutely bonkers. He just started throwing those tables over, demanding the people that ran those tables and those money changers to get out. And he wasn't angry with money. Oh, Jesus is against money. He saw money and he went crazy. No, he was angry that people were being prevented from freely accessing his Father. And to this day, that's the number one thing that causes God's nostrils to flare. That we would either stay away from him, or that there would be a system set up, it's called religion, by the way, to prevent us from coming to him. But know this, God's slow to anger, and because he's motivated by love and compassion, there's certain things he does get angry at. Motivated by love and compassion.